great to be able to be your speaker this morning. I love this congregation, and I particularly love the people of the congregation. And I pray that I can say some things that will help you have a closer relationship with God, maybe correct a few things in your life if needed. So that's what we're going to try to accomplish this morning. And I'm sad to know that there are members of our congregation who aren't feeling well and have kind of some things that hopefully they can get over pretty soon and be back with us, because I know the flu's going around and who knows what else is going around this time of season. So, but hopefully it's nothing we can't get through and survive, so to speak. This morning I wanted to speak to you about be prepared is the lesson. And this lesson I've had for a while, but it always helps me to understand what Jesus was teaching in the book of Matthew. In the book of Matthew, Matthew the 24th chapter specifically is what we'll be kind of looking at this morning. And Jesus taught several parables right in a row. And he was trying to teach people to be prepared for his second coming. And maybe they didn't fully understand it all, but the parables were very powerful. And kind of according to the book of Matthew, this was some of his last teaching or his last sermon that Matthew recorded. And so these are some things that Jesus was trying to teach the disciples and teach those who were listening and teach us about being prepared for a second coming. Now, if you had one last thing to tell people, if you had one last sermon, so to speak, to talk to people about, maybe we would have given a lesson on how important love is, or maybe how important the family is, or the importance of the church. But Jesus, his last sermon, according to the book of Matthew, was being prepared for heaven and staying out of hell. In Matthew the 24th chapter, these 3 verses here, it says, "Watch therefore," this is Jesus talking, "for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." And we can all relate to this in the sense that Jesus says you need to be watching. In other words, you need to be prepared for when the Lord comes. And he gives a short little example here that if someone knew when someone was going to break into their house or come onto their property and steal something, then we would be prepared to prevent that or intercept that or something to that effect. You know, we, just an example, this last week, we had on camera that on this property a few days ago, 2 men pulled up in their pickup truck, and they parked right over here. And one of them, well, they both got out of their pickup, and one of them opened up our shed, which is not locked because there's nothing in there valuable, because people kept breaking the lock off, just trying to see if there was something valuable in there, just to walk away. There's not much of value. So we stopped locking it so we would quit breaking the lock. But one of them was the lookout, and one of them just opened the door and peeked in there. And didn't see anything they liked. I guess they were looking for lawn equipment or something like that. And they drove off. They were on a property less than 3 minutes in broad daylight. And so we have pictures of them, but, who knows who they are. But the point is, if we had known that was going to happen, which we kind of do, it happens from time to time, but if we had known exactly when it was going to happen, I probably would have had my truck parked right there, the knowing they showed up, and they probably would have kept on going. So Jesus gives a very viable example of, hey, if we knew when the thieves were coming, we would prevent that, or we would do something. We would be prepared in that sense. And so Jesus gave 3 parables in the book of Matthew, in this chapter and the following chapter, concerning his return. And he's teaching this to us and teaching it to them. And he gave the example of the wise and foolish servants, and he gave the example of the 10 bridesmaids, which we could give a whole sermon on each one of these parables. And he gave the example of the 3 servants and the talents. And they were supposed to be using their talents while the master was away. Let's read the parables of the wise and foolish servant. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his master made ruler over his household, to give them food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. Assuredly, I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, and in an hour when he was not aware of, and will cut him in two and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So Jesus gives this example, this parable, and says, hey, the master leaves and he puts somebody in charge. And then when he comes back and he finds this good servant who is going about the business that master told him to go about. He's doing those things which he's supposed to be doing. He's working and keeping things in order and keeping the property in good shape and taking care of the affairs of the property. And so Jesus says, that servant is going to be rewarded for doing those things. Even though his master's gone, he's working and doing those things he's supposed to be doing. And then on the contrary, there's the servant who Jesus describes as evil. When his master's gone, he's like, I'm going to do what I want. And he starts to be cruel to the other servants that he's been put in charge of. He starts to, be a drunkard. And he is not at a point where he stops looking for his master to come. But his master does come. And he punishes him for not doing the things which he should be doing. So Jesus is giving a great example that most people can understand. When we talk about be prepared, a lot of us understand that this is the motto of the Boy Scouts. And I've given this example before. I was in the Boy Scouts. Me and my brother were in the Boy Scouts for probably about a year and a half, 2 years. Not a very long time. But we went to a smaller school, a little bit out in the country, just east of Norman. It was called Robin Hill School. Not many people have heard of it. It was a K through 8th grade school, which is a little bit unusual for that time and usual during this time. But as part of that school, they formed a Boy Scout troop. At least some men did. And it was very small. There were only 7 or 8 of us who joined the Boy Scout troop. And we went out and did the things the Boy Scouts did. It was a great experience for us. We went camping a lot in all seasons. I remember waking up in a tent in January, and there was snow on my tent. And there was frost inside of the tent. There was frost inside of my shoes. And the campfire was a little bit of a walk through the snow to get there. So things of that nature are very interesting to me, and it was a great experience. And on one particular occasion, we had an opportunity, or there was an opportunity for this young man from a different school, not too far away, and he was looking for a Boy Scout troop to join. And he was interested in joining our group, and so we invited him to come along on a camp out, an overnight stay out at Lake Thunderbird. And it was just a test, a trial period to see if we got along with him, he got along with us. But anyway, so he shows up on Friday afternoon where we were assembling to go camping, and he went along with us. And it soon turned out that he wasn't prepared to go camping because he brought a blanket, and I think he brought a pillow, but he didn't bring a tent. He brought a few snacks. He didn't really bring anything for a meal. And so for the next day or two, we were loaning him stuff so that he would be more comfortable. We were loaning him some food. He was eating with us. And by the time the weekend was over, we're like, yeah, he's not a good fit. In other words, he kind of looked a little bit foolish in our sight because he didn't bring the things necessary to go camping and have a good time while you're doing it. This wasn't a survival weekend where we had to go out and round up our own food in the wilderness. No, this was a camp out where we were supposed to be prepared. We're Boy Scouts after all. We need to bring these things. So he looked foolish in our eyes. Well, I give this example to think about, what does Jesus think about us? What does Jesus think about us in the way that we're living our life here on this earth? Are we living our life in a way that we're preparing for the inevitable, whether that be Jesus' second coming while we're alive, or whether it be for our earthly death, if you will? Well, if we're not living a life that is preparing for us for our spiritual, eternal home, then how does Jesus see us? Maybe he looks at us as being a little bit foolish this morning. So examine your own life. Do you look a little bit foolish, like the young man who's wasn't prepared to go on the camp out with us at Boy Scouts? Do you look a little bit foolish in the sense that maybe you're acting in ways that are not right? You're acting in ways that are sinful. You're participating in things that are not appropriate for a Christian. Well, you need to understand, and you do probably, hopefully most of us understand, there's a day of reckoning coming. Reckoning is probably a word too, but reckoning that is coming for all of us. And we need to take that seriously because Jesus has said, and many times when we'll look at it, that I'm coming at a time when you don't expect it. And so you need to be ready for that event because it is a surety. And we'll read some chapters about that. When we talk about the second coming of Christ, the New Testament is filled with us talking about Jesus' return. There's numerous verses, and we just have 2 or 3 here. In Acts the first chapter, verse 11, who also said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven." Hebrews 9:28, so Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time apart from sin for salvation. And then our last verse on this is 1 Thessalonians 5:2. For you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. I gave this lesson, I think, when I was over in Zambia, Africa. And of course, I was being I had an interpreter speaking in their native tongue, but I gave this lesson and I got to this part, I talked about thieves in the night and thievery, and they understand that to a great extent, just like it's kind of the common plague of humanity, no matter where you're at in the world. But I could look at their faces, and even though we spoke different languages, I could see a little bit of a shock on their face when they have thieves in America. And we're, as a country, we're kind of looked at from third world countries as this great place, which it is. But they kind of have in their minds maybe a different reality where it's a utopia or something like that. And we have a great standard of living and so on and so forth, but I could see on their face, they were a little bit shocked. There's thieves. I told them, I don't leave anything of value out on my porch too long because somebody might come and take it. But they were a little bit surprised at that. But this is something that we need to be prepared for, the second coming of Jesus and the day of judgment and our physical death, if you will, upon the earth. We need to be ready for that because it's a certainty. Well, let's talk a little bit. Forgot to move my slides forward a little bit. So Jesus' return is certain and his return is final. So what happens when he returns? Well, I think most of us understand there's going to be a judgment. We're going to be judged on our life. We're going to be judged on our faithfulness to God and his word. And that means there's going to be a separation for us. The word separate is kind of a sad word, but let's read Matthew, the 25th chapter, verse 32 and 33. It says here, Jesus is teaching, all nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And he will set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on his left. So there's going to be a separation during that judgment when Jesus is who is his faithful and who is not. And as we said before, the word separate is kind of a sad word when we think about this separation that's going to happen. This could be a mother will be separated from a daughter or a father from a son. These scenarios could happen. A husband could be separated from his wife because they're not living the same life. To separate people on earth is kind of sorrowful, isn't it? But when you think of it being done for an eternity, well, that's a horrible thought for us to think about, especially when one group is destined for heaven and the other group is destined for hell. Now, there are some who try to dismiss the idea of hell. And there are people in the religious world that do that. They said, there's not really a hell. It's just something that preachers use to try to motivate us or manipulate us or things of that nature. And they try to say, a loving God wouldn't send people to hell. A loving God wouldn't send something that they've created to a terrible, terrible place for eternity. But what we have to understand is to dismiss the doctrine of hell, if you will, is to dismiss a core teaching of Jesus. Jesus taught that this place existed. In Luke, the 16th chapter, verse 19, he gave that example of the rich man and Lazarus. The doctrine of hell is one taught by Jesus himself. And when people try to dismiss it, they don't understand exactly what they're doing. I would present to you, because when you dismiss the doctrine of hell, what you're really doing is dismissing the presence of a loving God and the presence of a free choice. So let me explain that. We are free. We have a free choice to either love God or not love God. He invites us to love him. He urges us to love him. He sent his son to die on a cross that we might love him. But in the end, the choice is up to us. of whether we love him or not. Now, God explains the benefits. He outlines the promises. He articulates the consequences. And then, in the end, the choice is up to us, whether we love him or not. In Matthew, the 25th chapter, and I'm not sure if I put this up here or not, I did. It says, in verse 41, it says, "Then he will also say to those on the left hand, 'Depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels.'" Hell was not prepared for people. Hell wasn't prepared for us. It wasn't created for us. It's something that God created for the devil and his angels. So for a person to go to hell, this place of terrible torment, then is for a person to go against God's intended destiny for his creation. You see, hell is man's choice. It's not God's choice for us. Hell is the chosen place of the person who loves themselves more than they love God. For the person who loves sin more than they love the Savior. And who loves the world more than God's world. Judgment is that moment when God looks at the rebellious heart and says, your choice will be honored. To say there is no hell is to say that God condones the rebellious, unrepentant heart. To say there is no hell is to portray God with blind eyes to the hunger and evil in the world. To say there is no hell is to say God has no justice, no sense of right or wrong. And eventually they say that God has no love. For true love hates that which is evil. So we see that the doctrine of hell, the teaching of hell is real. It's a real place, and we can't dismiss it. But we have to prepare for our eternal home, to choose which path we want to follow, whether God's way or the world's way. And so you could simplify this and say that we need to choose our eternal home. And that's our choice. And in Jesus' first sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 7, he taught about choosing. In those teachings, he said, choose where you build your house, your spiritual house, whether it's on the rock or on the sand. He said, choose which path you're going to take, whether it's through the wide gate or the narrow gate, and with spiritual meaning here. Choose between the big crowd, the popular way, or the small crowd. The certainty of heaven, or the certainty of hell, or the joy of heaven. Jesus taught, his last sermon instructs us to choose to be prepared. Now, you can afford to make a lot of wrong choices in your life. Some of us are older, some of you are younger, but we still can reflect on choices that we make in our life. And some of those choices we regret. Some of those choices we understand we could have made a better choice. And we deal with it. And we move on with our lives. And you can afford to make a lot of wrong choices in your life. You can choose the wrong career, and you can survive that. You can choose the wrong city to live in, and you can survive that. You can choose the wrong house to live in, and you can survive that. You can even choose the wrong person to marry, and you can survive that. But there's one choice that must be made correctly, and that is your eternal destiny. And Jesus taught us about this. He called us to choose to be prepared. I'm going to conclude with the story of Sir Ernest Shackleton. Some of you have heard this before. Sir Ernest Shackleton, obviously he was English because he has the title Sir in his name, but he was a pretty great explorer in the early 1900s. And one of his more famous expeditions, he put together a group of men, and he had sponsors, and he was going to set out to find the South Pole in the Antarctic. And if you're familiar with the Antarctic, it's a land mass. Obviously, it's very cold, lots of ice, lots of snow. And the South Pole somewhere in there, but it was treacherous to get to. It was dangerous to get to. But he put together a group of very brave men, and they got into a boat, and he had sponsors. They brought along supplies, and they brought along someone to document their exploration. That's why we have this real picture. This is a real picture of the men. And they set sail, and they got into all kinds of trouble. They got down as they were trying to approach the land of Antarctica. Their ship got trapped in the sea ice, and it was very dangerous. And they got so trapped, the ice came in and surrounded their ship down in the Antarctica region, and they were stuck. And as some of you may or may not realize, sea ice shifts, and it started to tear their boat up, and they were afraid the boat was going to sink. In fact, they knew it was going to sink. So they got off this boat on this sea ice, and they abandoned ship, and they took as much supplies as they could, and they had no way back home. But if you read the account, and there are books written on this, Sir Ernest Shackleton, he led his men, and they trekked across the ice, pulling a spare boat across the ice, loaded down with supplies, and it was hard going. And sea ice, this wasn't just some smooth strips of ice. It had crevasses. It had where it was broken up. It was hard to find a path through. But they finally made it to this small island. It's called Elephant Island. And it's a deserted place. Nothing there but penguins and seals and creatures that can survive the cold. And they got there, and then they said, now what are we going to do? We are trapped without a ship, and no one's coming for us. And so Sir Ernest Shackleton and five other men, they fixed up this small boat. It's more of a lifeboat, but they fixed it up and they worked on it, and they were going to set sail for help to go find it. And the closest place to go was the Georgia island, where they knew there was a whaling station. And they had to navigate hundreds of miles across the rough, cold sea of Antarctica and navigate by the stars with their little device and find this small island called the Georgia Island. It was a near impossible task, but they pulled it off, and they lived to tell about it. And so this part of the story is just a short illustration from the Book of Illustrations, Encyclopedia of Illustrations, and I'm just going to read it to you. And it says, while on one of his expeditions to the Antarctic, Sir Ernest Shackleton left some of his men on Elephant Island with the intent of returning for them and carrying them back to England. But he was delayed. By the time he could go back for them, the sea had frozen and he had no access to the island. 3 times he tried to reach them, but was prevented by the ice. Finally, on his 4th try, he broke through and found a narrow channel. Much to his surprise, he found the crewmen waiting for him, supplies packed and ready to board. They were soon on their way back to England. He asked them how they knew to be ready for him at that particular time. They told him they didn't know when he would return, but they were sure that he would. So every morning, the leader rolled up his bag and packed his gear and told the crew to do the same, saying, "Get your things ready, boys. The boss may come today." It's a powerful illustration. These men were stuck. I can't remember the exact time, but it was months on this island, waiting for rescue, waiting for their leader to come back, not knowing if he'd even survived the near impossible trip in the ship, the little boat that they had taken. But yet one day, they looked out onto the ocean and they saw the ship coming for rescue. And this is an actual picture again of them and the men and them surviving for that time, waiting for the boss to return. And they packed their bags, their gear every day, just in case that was the day that he returned. That's an example I want us to think about, is having our spiritual bags packed and ready to go every day. Are you ready this morning for the return of Jesus Christ? Or are you ready this morning for your physical death in case that happens before it returns? I give an example every once in a while of that Edwin Morris, of what we would call the old preacher these days. He gave an example in the pulpit. At the time he was preaching, he was in his 80s, and he basically said, every one of you will probably outlive me, but I could outlive any one of you. Meaning life is not certain. Any one of us could die in a tragic way, in a way that we're not ready for or we didn't expect. But we need to be ready for that. We need to have our spiritual bags packed and ready to go, as we have discussed this morning. This morning, Jesus wants you to become a member of his church. He wants you to respond to his invitation, respond to the gospel of invitation, of repenting of your sinful life, repenting of your life without him in it. He wants you to confess his name, that he is the Son of God, and be baptized for remission of sin. If you're a Christian here this morning, a member of the Lord's church, and you have some baggage, so to speak, that's not good, or you have sin in your life, you need to get rid of that. You need to be prepared for the Lord's return. We invite you to do so while we come.